Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Global Justice. The title of this conference is Mexico in the Time of Trump. And our guest is Laura Carlsen. Laura Carlsen is the director of the Mexico City-based international relations think tank, MIRA, Feminists and Democracies. She coordinates political analysis and global solidarity with Just Associates. She holds an interdisciplinary degree in women's studies and a master's in Latin American studies, both from Stanford University. She's also a journalist, and she makes a lot of research, mainly about gender equality. So let's welcome Laura with a big applause.
Is it possible to just turn the camera quickly to the audience? Yeah, there we go. I'm sure I see many familiar faces. And so I have to start by saying I am so sorry that I couldn't be there with you. I really, up until the last minute, as Liz will attest, I had planned to do that. And then the accumulation of transportation and work and just time made it impossible. So I really apologize, and we will do it again soon, I hope, because it's always a pleasure to be in your community, to talk to each one of you and the important work you're doing. Be able to have that kind of personal contact. So thank you for accepting my decision in the end, which was pretty much forced by those accumulation of factors, to do this by Zoom. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Now, I wanted to start with many of you have followed the Americas program for quite some time now. As you know, we've been working for 45 years on the impact of U.S. policy on Latin America and on social movements, and how citizens can change, and migrants, how can change policies and politics from the ground up in countries all over the region. We continue to do that basically with the same team in large part. And as I may have mentioned before in a talk here, it was about a year ago, or maybe a little bit more, that we changed the name to MIRA, Feminisms and Democracies. So the reason that we did with this was because that we recognized after a while of working that we were progressively more and more using a feminist model of analysis for international relations, which just very briefly, and we ourselves have been going deeper into what this means, is not just saying, okay, now what's happening to women and adding that into the equation, or as one of our mentors in this, the international relations expert, Mariana Marchand, says, it's not just add women and stir, but having a deeper analysis that looks to some different set of questions when we talk about international relations. These questions include, first and foremost, of course, what's the impact on people, on the population in general, on women, but also on the population in general, on families, on children. It also has an very explicit, in our case, and there's a lot of feminisms, which is why we say feminisms, but it also has a very explicit anti-militarism, anti-patriarchal, anti-imperialist, and anti-fascist, which is an important one lately, orientation in terms of how we do the analysis. On March 8th, just 2 days ago, we witnessed the strength of women's movements in confronting neo-fascist movements throughout the hemisphere, and in terms of being one of the most, what we saw in Mexico, at least here in Mexico City, was being probably the most capable movement in terms of its mobilization. There were over 200,000 women and supporters in the streets. It was largely peaceful, and the demands continued to be an end to violence against women. So in Argentina, we saw that despite the the rulings and the recent laws against protests that are violating the right to protest in that country under the government of Javier Milei, also thousands and thousands of women and other people marched during that march. And I guess it was weeks ago, the LGBTQ community actually organized one of the largest marches against this white supremacist and anti-women and uh, what do they, I mean, basically patriarchal movement of Javier Milei. So we're seeing very strong movements, and for us, this is a good sign because there are also more movements that are more autonomous from local governments. That's the orientation that we're going to talk about. It's intersectional. It's based on, like I say, not just the rights of women, but also all types of diversity, which have come under attack from the United States, which is one of the points that we'll be talking about in the talk. So I want to go quickly through some of the main areas in which the Trump administration, in its second version now, is having an impact on our lives here in Mexico and on the world and on the lives of our families and loved ones in the United States as well. The first, of course, would be tariffs and economic policy. When we look at the tariffs and economic policy, what we see for it, and when there was a big march on Sunday, I'm sure you all saw it, or a big gathering on Sunday in the Zocalo, in support of President Claudia Sheinbaum's attitude towards the tariff threats that have come out of the Trump administration. To give a very brief chronology, on day one, Trump announced that there would be tariffs against Mexico and Canada, and then announced that there would be tariffs, and they were suspended through a negotiation with the government of Claudia Sheinbaum. And then most recently, there was a call on March 6th that resulted in another suspension to April 2nd. This latest suspension is supposedly, there's a difference of opinion. It's all very confusing. And so I'm not going to go into like deep detail on it because there's not even a clarity as to what is impacted and what is not. But according to the US government, this latest suspension will only apply to 50% will continue to enter in. The Secretary of Economy here in Mexico says that there are only 10% that it would be applied to because the criteria is that anything that's already under the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement will be suspended from tariffs during this period. Yesterday's speech emphasized the strengthening of the internal economy and market, which is something we've been emphasizing for a long time to reduce dependency on the United States, broadening self-sufficiency, particularly in food and energy, again, something that progressive movements have emphasized, promoting public investment in creating employment, and which is a kind of a indirect way of saying that there will be less reliance on international investment, and particularly U.S. investment, to create employment and to promote national production. There's also a commitment to continue with the social programs that have been successful and to establish a friendly but respectful relationship with the United States. In our program, we have a weekly Spanish language program that I'd like to invite everybody to watch. It's on Rompeviento TV and on YouTube called Hecho en America. And just in general, there's a network of us who talk to other countries and especially social movements in those countries. Within that network, there's kind of a universal, not universal, it's divided, but there's a widespread admiration for Claudia Sheinbaum for standing up to Donald Trump in these contexts. She has continuously reiterated the need to respect national sovereignty, and while not being confrontational, has managed to negotiate these delays. Now, Canada has as well. In fact, there have been some strong speeches out of Canada regarding the tariff threats, and the tariffs were suspended also for a large part of Canada's exports. What's really happening here, and this is not to minimize the position that Claudia Sheinbaum has taken on this, which I think there has been a successful negotiation in that sense. But what's really happening here is that Donald Trump knows full well and has been made to understand that the tariffs on Mexico and Canada in particular will have a devastating effect on certain sectors within the United States and on US consumers, which are very sensitive, particularly to the issue of inflation. And if their tariffs, as many people have told him, although he has not recognized it publicly, who eventually pays those tariffs are the importers and the consumers. So there was an immediate outcry from sectors like the car manufacturers, the automobile sector. So the first thing that happened was that they were exempted from the tariffs in this latest round. And there was an outcry also from farmers and from electronics sectors and from a number of other organized sectors that have now created these integrated supply chains that depend on exports from Mexico because they're part of their same corporation. You know, they're part of their same chain of production. The bilateral trade is now $839 billion a year. And Claudia Sheinbaum has been very clear that if the tariffs go into effect, they will be confronted with counter tariffs on the Mexico side. That's where, say, the corn exporters and some other sensitive sectors that have supported Donald Trump are beginning to get worried. So he's kind of set himself up between a rock and a hard place on this tariff issue. Not only does he have the problem that there's sectors of the US economy that are against this. I mean, take the Wall Street Journal coming out with a headline that's basically tariffs, the stupidest move ever. You know, I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but that was essentially the gist of it against Donald Trump and this whole plan. Um, and then the sectors in the United States that are rejecting it, but then also the political hay that was made as a result of these tariff threats. Now we have Claudia Sheinbaum, a center-left government in Mexico with 85% approval rate, probably, you know, way above Donald Trump's. And we have the Trudeau government coming out with a very strong statement against the tariffs. And although Trudeau himself is on his way out, you know, there's been a galvanization of forces in these two countries that are against the scenario that the Trump administration is trying to impose on them. So it's not working out well for him in terms of the tariff threats, and he's going to continue. And this is basically my take on it, that he will continue to do this suspension thing as a sort of Damocles that he'll hold over the two governments' heads to try to negotiate other things. So far, I mean, what's been negotiated here in Mexico, oftentimes we don't know exactly because a lot of it happens behind the scenes. We know that immigration policy, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, continues to be basically contention, which is in itself an human rights policy. And we know that it was announced that 10,000 additional National Guard would go to the border, which is also policy that is not only ineffective but violates human rights. But it's not new. It's not exactly, like a major concession because the National Guard has been at the border for a very long time, and there have been different moments in the history of these tariff threats and Mexico responses in which they've announced that they were sending far greater numbers of troops to the border itself. So it doesn't appear that the concessions so far have been major, but this will continue to be an ongoing issue because what's really happening here is Donald Trump throwing his weight around and trying to figure out how far he can push in terms of creating a situation of subordination among these trade partners. Of course, the U.S. Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, it has to be renegotiated in 2026. Everybody's kind of looking toward that as well and what's going to happen. But at the same time, what's happening in Mexico as a result of this is essentially a positive move. If you talk about reducing dependency by stimulating an internal market, by creating more consumption of national goods, and you can see in the city, there's campaigns of boycotts against Starbucks, against Walmarts. I mean, in other places, I'm sure that you've been seeing it there. The lists go out. And the idea is that, okay, we're under attack and we're going to close ranks among ourselves to survive this. So it's really not the response that Donald Trump wanted to see. And that's why I think that we won't actually see a trade war develop between the United States and Mexico because it's not in the United States' interests. The Yale University Budget Lab estimated that tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico could increase inflation by a full percentage point and cut growth by half a percentage point while costing the average U.S. household about $1,600 in disposable income. We've also seen that every time these tariff threats come out, the stock market in the United States plummets. So those are pretty clear signs to the Trump administration about the dangers of proceeding on this track. If we move to immigration, which is the other flashpoint in U.S.-Mexico relations, what we see is, first of all, we have a team on immigration composed of what is probably migrants' worst nightmare. We have Secretary of Homeland Security, the South Dakota Governor, Kristi Noem, famous for going from South Dakota, obviously not a border state, to the border with National Guard troops to fully project the image of the hard line against immigration as a national security threat, which every statistic known to man and woman has proven completely invented in terms of there's no national security threat that comes from migrants coming over the border. We also have Tom Homan as the czar of border security, long history of hard line on immigration, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and Stephen Miller, who designed some of these archaic laws that are then revived to use against migrants and to deny asylum in particular, as the brain behind a lot of these anti-immigrant policies. With that team in place, though, what has happened is kind of a mixed bag. And it's interesting to analyze some of the statistics because they have an impact on Mexico, and they certainly have an impact on Mexicans living in the United States. So in the United States, just in the past month, we've had 23,000 arrests and 18,000 deportations. The arrests are up. They are, and they're particularly taking place away from the border, but they're not as high as during the first Trump administration. The detentions have gone from about 250 a day to close to 700, which is a significant leap. And what's happening is that the deportations have not gone up significantly. So we have an increase in 4,000 people up to about 44,000 that are going straight into detention. What we know about this, and we've been saying it for a long time, is immigrant detention is big business. And it happens to be a big business that has directly supported the Trump campaign and the Trump administration. GEO stock, one of the biggest operators of immigrant detention center, has gone way up since Donald Trump came in office. So they're holding people there. The federal government, which is supposed to be reduced under DOGE and all these efforts, is paying millions and millions of dollars to GEO and other private companies to hold a vastly increased number of people in detention. We also can see from the statistics that despite the rhetoric of the Trump administration, only about half of these people who are being held in detention have a criminal conviction. The new policy now is to go after adults with deportation orders who have children. That is to say, they just recently announced a policy that will go after complete families. I'm sure that many of you have read and seen some of the testimonies of what this is doing to the immigrant community in the United States. People are afraid to go outside, to go to public parks. They're afraid to live their normal lives because of what's happening and the risk of being deported. I think right now, probably the fear factor has been the greatest impact on human lives, even above the actual deportation factors, in terms of what's happening. And this is by design. It's a design to create a level of social control over immigrants within society, which is being remolded into a white supremacist society. And I think racism here is a huge factor. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But also within the labor market, when you have workers who live in fear, you have workers who can be controlled, who can be super exploited, who can be used and discarded when the company or the sector or the general labor market needs to do that. That's always been the role of migrant workers, and now that role has been intensified under the Trump administration. As far as the response of the Sheinbaum government, so far, what we see is a continuation. We have to remember in this context, too, that the Biden government did very little to change the immigration paradigm, in spite of the fact that it did eliminate a large number of some of this there were more than 250 executive orders that had to do with immigration from the Trump government. But then the programs that were later put in place were also programs that were designed to deny the right to asylum, to international asylum, and to contain immigration rather than looking for a way to logically and reasonably integrate it into what is the very real labor demand in the United States. So the Lopez Obrador government went along with this. And during the first Trump administration, of course, they put into place a number of programs that were designed to keep people from coming to the border and to what we call externalize the border of the United States, which is to say that Mexico became the buffer zone for the anti-immigrant policies of the United States government. The Sheinbaum government has kept the current head of the National Institute of Migration in place, a hardliner by the name of Francisco Garduño, who came under public scrutiny when 40 migrants were killed by locking them into a detention center in Ciudad Juarez that caught on fire. He has not been removed. he's still, despite his attitude and his responsibility in the deaths, in particular of these migrants, he's still in office. There's really still not any different policy on the part of the Mexican government or strategy to deal with migratory trends. We have seen a decrease in trends, but it's hard for us as researchers and analysts to quantify because for whatever reason, the Trump administration decided to cease to publicize apprehensions at the border ever since he was elected in November. So it's a situation that's difficult to determine, but we can tell that there have been decreases for the time being in the flows that are coming up through Mexico. But we also know that the push factors are pretty much exactly the same or worse because the hunger, the violence in Central America and now in other parts of the world too that are coming through this part of the world to get to the United States continues to be unresolved, to say the least. No. Um, Sheinbaum has said that the most humane form of attending to migratory flows is to increase development so that people are not forced into migration. In fact, most of her policies that have been announced basically reiterate policies in the past that while they seem to be having some kind of a long-term impact, creating more jobs, they don't really have a short-term impact and they are not really dealing with how to create humane responses for the people who are already migrating. We continue to see a contention policy. We continue to see a lot of repression. The National Guard last year spent more time going after migrants than it did going after criminals in terms of detentions and just hunting people down. Now, when we look at another flashpoint in the relationship, which is the drug war and fentanyl, it's also been a point where the Mexican government has, to a limited degree, stood up to Donald Trump. From January to February since he took office, the Sheinbaum government announced that the amount of fentanyl seized at the border dropped more than 41%, citing, and this is with data from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So she believes and presented this figure as proof that they are reducing the flows of fentanyl to the United States. Excuse me. In her speech yesterday, she said that the strategy to avoid drugs flowing into the United States is part of the plan to reach a situation of peace and security in the country, and that it basically is based on attention to the root causes of what causes those flows. So the proposals are to use more and better train National Guard, to rely on intelligence and investigation, to coordinate more between the security and a cabinet secretary and the Attorney General's office, because the part that has to do with justice has been stagnated or basically non-functional forever for a very long time. And then to work more with the states and with the public. What we're not hearing here is any kind of change in the basic drug war approach of going after kingpins, of trying to control supply, when everything we know about drug flows to the United States, or particularly about overdose deaths, and about the work of the DEA, which has spent trillions of dollars in taxpayer money. Let's see when DOJ goes after the DEA, which they won't, is that supply side measures don't work. They never, first of all, actually managed to control black markets that are trafficking over the US border because of the complicity of US officials and US criminal networks, number one. And number two, the problem of overdose deaths in the United States is not because people can get it, it's because people want it, you know? So the demand that continues in the United States, despite the fact that it's general knowledge that fentanyl can kill you, is a much deeper social problem than what can be addressed by invading Mexico. There's always been a smokescreen set up by the DEA in this focus on supply side measures, which has to do with the relationship between these illegal networks and the vast amounts of money that they generate within the United States, because obviously that's where things are sold at retail prices. Those are the networks that deliver to the final consumers. Those are the banks that launder the money. You know, the whole contribution of illicit drug trade to the so-called legitimate economy in the United States is so intrinsic and so deep and so enormous that nobody has ever really tried to stop it. But by creating this smokescreen, like we're going to blame Mexico, they managed to first create this narrative, that racist narrative too, that Mexican cartels are the problem when most of the arrests for distribution in the United States are US citizens. They managed to create a pretext for greater control over Mexico, and they managed to divert public attention from the fact that the United States has not been able to go to the roots of why young people would turn to such a dangerous practice, and to why so many people are dying without ability to regulate or to create health services that could prevent so many of these deaths. These are some of the points that the Mexican government has raised in this, and it's also been raised a number of times, the way in which in which U.S. gun manufacturers are taking advantage of this situation by producing guns directly for the black market and smuggling to Mexican cartels. There are currently a number of lawsuits in the United States from the Mexican government that are suing the arms manufacturers for knowingly supplying a black market, and complains that the United States government is not doing enough. It's an attempt to show that this is reciprocal, that the focus of the problem is wrong, but at the same time, we are seeing a bilateral drug war model that perpetuates many of these myths being carried out by both governments. It's an inertia that that despite all the evidence available, we have not been able to break because it's convenient to the armed forces, it's convenient to the security forces, and to deeply invested interests within both countries in some senses. There's a new head at the DEA. The relationship with the DEA, of course, and between Mexico and the DEA has always been problematic. They're taking a harder line now, even than what they've taken in the past. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, moving to foreign policy, one of the things that we've been looking at a lot here in the program is the basically the closing of USAID. This happened first with an executive order that suspended foreign aid for 90 days right after the day that President Trump took office, and it focused specifically on USAID and on a program called PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Program for Attention to AIDS, which is particularly cruel and genocidal practically. And on February 26th, the federal court said that they had to pay out at least $2 billion for work that had already been done. And we should comment here that what Trump is doing is something he's done in the past in many contexts, which is called wage theft in the United States. He's actually saying that he is not going to pay people who had contracts approved by Congress and did the work already for work that was already done in order to save money. The degree in which, the rule of law is being violated on every level within many of these measures is almost mind-blowing. So the government didn't comply with it. Rubio has limited about 90% of the contracts, but most of this is coming from Elon Musk. Then the Supreme Court decided that the freeze was illegal in a divided decision with Trump's conservative men, and some are pre-Trump, Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh voting against it. But they lost, and it's still not being complied with. We're talking about $60 billion. We're getting some reports here from Mexico and certainly reports from other parts of the world too, that NGOs in particular are being hard hit. They may have to close their doors. Some of you may have stories from there about what's happening in terms of these cutbacks. There have been 5,800 projects that were closed, 500 more are frozen, and about half the staff has been laid out. Now, in our program, we have never received USAID money, and we've always been critical of it because it's called a form of soft power, which is to say, this is not just like magnanimous how do you say that word? Anyway, this is not just like from the from the good of our heart giving out aid for humanitarian projects, although there are some worthwhile humanitarian projects that get it, but it's a form of also promoting U.S. interests in other countries by creating dependency and by having a series of very politicized conditions attached to most of this aid. However, to cut that off from one day to the next is a different story that even the harshest critics of USAID, as we've actually been, cannot condone because of the number of human lives that are at stake here. It's even more dramatic when you talk about African countries, because in reality, Latin America receives a minimal proportion of this aid, but it still has a major impact. And although they say that there are safeguards involved in it, a whistleblower, Nicholas Enrich, publicized the fact that they haven't, in fact, implemented safeguards for humanitarian aid clearly reveals what the political leadership believes about this. In other words, that they really don't care. So, and he, of course, was immediately sent home. There's organizations like Caritas International that says that the ruthless and chaotic way this senseless decision is being implemented threatens the life and dignity of millions of people. And that's already having an impact. Now, I've talked to organizations that have received it in the past, and it kind of depends on how dependent they were. Some large organizations, at least an environmental organization, said, we're happy to be rid of them. We have never received a grant that was so difficult, so neo-colonial, and so had so many conditions, as USAID said had. And I know that, of course, the organizations that were receiving AID money have not, I think, wanted to come out. Most of them either are instructed that they can't, or they don't want to come out and really talk about their experiences. But the scuttlebutt is that it's having a huge impact, and it's causing a huge reconfiguration. The estimate, in fact, is that up to a third, and this is globally, not just Mexico, of NGOs will go under because of these decisions. So that's a huge thing in terms of how we work. The other point on foreign policy, well, there's a couple that's important to mention that has a huge impact on Mexico is the involvement with multilateral organizations. We have a withdrawal from the World Health Organization and from the Paris Accords. We have the withdrawal from the United Nations Human Rights Council and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. Under review are a number of other major multilateral organizations, including UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and some others as well. So, I mean, if we take a long view, the implications for Mexico are huge, although there's very little, it seems, that we can do about it. The government, as far as I know, hasn't really made statements. But we already saw the way in which infectious diseases globalize. So there's a measles outbreak because of a lot of they have an anti-vax health secretary in the United States. All of these threats that are likely to flourish in the United States are also likely to cross the border. The promotion of fossil fuels without restriction is something that, of course, impacts the entire planet and that basically will end up canceling out the efforts that any other countries can make in terms of life-threatening climate change in the near future. I want to mention Gaza. It's not our region, but it's important because I truly believe that it's the ethical test of our time. They cut off assistance to the UN agency that provides humanitarian assistance at this moment of crisis. There's been recent statements that Israel's deliberate weaponization of starvation has left 345,000 people facing catastrophic food insecurity. 90% of children aged 6 to 23 months and pregnant and breastfeeding women are in severe food poverty. And the other day, just as they were cutting off aid to all these things I've talked about, as well as Ukraine, Marco Rubio sent $4 billion in arms to Israel without going through Congress or anybody else. I really recommend that as many of you as can go to No Other Land at the showing that was announced at the beginning of this session. I just recently went, and it's one thing to follow the issue and to read about it, but when you see the evil and the cruelty and the resistance of the Palestinian people on the ground in this documentary, it changes your perspective radically. Even if you were obviously, sympathetic to the issue between, perhaps it doesn't change your perspective. I should just say it changes your emotional and human response by seeing that directly. Be careful that you don't feel impotence when you go or when you see some of these other issues and everything coming down so fast and heavy. It seems to be immobilizing a large part of social movements within the United States. There's a feeling that it's a period of shock. Of course, we can only hope that that shock doesn't last for a long time. What the human body does in shock, I was just thinking about this when I said it, um, is it numbs it, It says this is more that we can deal with right now. It numbs the human body to pain, and it's a defensive reaction. It's a good thing, but when we talk about this in terms of our emotional reactions and particularly to things that cannot ever be accepted or normalized, then we have to recognize that that period of shock has to end probably as soon as possible. Then finally, and this is super important, is the pivot to Russia. For many of you who watched that video with Zelensky, and I have to say that I'm not a big Zelensky fan, that there's a besides the just rudeness and the macho ganging up on somebody in public television, what came out of it was a very clear statement of a pivot to Russia. So we're looking at this geopolitical situation in which we've got this ultra imperialist, patriarchal, anti-democratic president in the United States making a very clear and explicit alliance with the same adjectives president in Russia. This is a major threat to the entire planet. The European Union is reacting by arming itself, which is probably the worst thing it can do because it just accelerates the arms race and the possibilities of a major war breaking out. And other places in the world are trying to just figure it out day by day. In Mexico, of course, the reaction has been a response to reaffirm sovereignty, while at the same time negotiating some aspects with Donald Trump. It's been a stronger response than I expected because we do have still a neoliberal government that's highly dependent on the United States economy. And we saw a Lopez Obrador presidency that not only caved under tariff threats to a Trump administration, but that also went out on a limb to praise Donald Trump. And I think that that was confusing to many of us, and that contributed to a narrative that normalized many of the things that Trump was doing. Now we have a far more extreme Trump administration, when we have a different administration here in Mexico. And Sheinbaum has been careful to say, we know we have to maintain a good relationship with the United States, but there's certain things that we won't accept. And so she's been walking a finer line on this and has not gone so far as to eulogize, Donald Trump or to praise Donald Trump in this context. One of the basic things that Mexico would have to do in this new geopolitical setting is create stronger South-South ties. And I want to move a little faster so we've got time for questions and discussion, because I'm really interested in talking to everyone about this. But essentially, the Community for Latin American and Caribbean states, the CELAC by Spanish initiatives, would be the place to do that. And there was some effort in the last administration here in Mexico to fortify that group. It's a group in which the United States government is not invited. However, what's been happening so far, there was an effort by the president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, to convoke the CELAC to talk about some of the measures that were coming down from the Trump administration. But the CELAC was devised to work by consensus. So every time there's an attempt to even have a meeting, Javier Milei in Argentina vetoes it. It's not clear how they're going to get over this, but if there isn't some mechanism developed to create South-South solidarity in the face of what's happening from the United States government, then we will be considerably weakened. And it will be very, very difficult for individual countries to stand up to this bully diplomacy. I don't think you can even call it diplomacy. The bully actions of the Trump administration in its way of dealing with the rest of the world to create a new era of U.S. hegemony that no longer respects rule of law, that no longer respects the basic democratic principles on which the country was founded. There's in Latin America, there's now a considerable progressive center left, however you want to define it, grouping: Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Honduras, Uruguay, Guatemala, Cuba, Venezuela in a different kind of position, Nicaragua, which I'm not going to add in because it's become an authoritarian state. There's a lot of pressure there's also potential for bringing in Caribbean states, but there's been major pressure from the Mexican government saying you either decide between China and us right now, or we cut off aid. And those are also countries that are highly reliant on aid. Of course, all of this is affected hugely by the new Cold War that's building up between China and the United States, although there's some division within the Trump administration between the kind of hawks who want to see a major division and a major repelling of China in terms of its presence in the countries, especially in Latin America, and between other people who basically just care about doing business, and whichever way, whatever works for that is going to be their priority. Last point, the culture wars. The culture wars that have been part of the Trump administration is this whole basket of arguments that have to do with anti-gender policies, anti-LGBTQ plus policies, racist policies, um, and this return to traditional families, to supposed traditional values. Now, these should not really be called culture wars, because when we think of wars, we tend to separate it from economic policies and geopolitical policies that are kind of like the meat and potatoes, whereas culture wars are either seen as a wedge issue that mobilizes a base, or as the traditional Marxist kind of superstructure that is used to sustain capitalism. In fact, as we look at what the far right is doing, not only in the United States but in other places, these issues are central to the white supremacist, the patriarchal, and the capitalist plan that's being imposed in so many countries. We have to take that into account as we look at what's happening and give them equal weight to the economic and the political, the more hardcore political policies that are coming out of here. We can see that, like I say, not only in the United States, but we see it very clearly in Argentina and in other countries. And that's why you see the feminist movements coming out so strongly in terms of linking up their own demands with an anti-fascist movement. We saw it on March 8th in Paris. We saw it in Argentina. Explicitly, we are an anti-fascist, anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist, anti-racist movement. It's the kind of linkages that we're going to need to move forward because of the degree of the threats. There's a lot of people think that this Trump radical reconfiguration of not just the United States, but the world itself is more likely to fall from internal contradictions than from anything those of us who oppose it will end up doing. There are a lot of internal contradictions, and I think we have to know how to use them as well. We just saw a recent cabinet meeting in which Elon Musk had basically a showdown with Marco Rubio, and also about where he publicly berated Rubio for not firing enough people in the State Department. He also had a showdown with the Secretary of Transportation, and it was very public kind of exposure of what some of those contradictions are. The Rubio, of course, was already upset because Doge closed off USAID, which was transferred to the Secretary of State, one of his major responsibilities. But the point is that there's tensions between what Elon Musk is doing in Doge, completely outside of a regular, U.S. governmental structure. And there's tensions and differences of opinion on many other issues as well. So we should be aware of how that's developing. And there's also, of course, there's growing response to the massive layoffs among federal employees. And I think we'll see growing responses to the rollback in basic civil liberties and human rights as we move forward as well. I want to just end with a few kind of recommendations because I know that I'm talking to a group of activists. You have, many of you, developed activism in the United States and are also working closely in San Miguel de Allende with groups that are supporting migrants, that are working for women's rights, and that are working on environmental issues as well. And that's one of the things that for me has always been very special about speaking to this group. And there's people who have like lifetime of experience in working on these issues, which will be so important to bring to the fore now as we create the kinds of alliances and the kinds of movements that we need that are have to cross borders as well, just like our lives do now. In order to make some kind of a change and to fight back. I think the first one is that every fight for the earth is crucial. In these days, partly for sanity and partly as a political strategy, I've been talking a lot to Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, and we've been talking about the impact of Donald Trump's policies, but talking also in general about where to go from here. There's a diametrically opposed worldview at play here. When you talk to Indigenous peoples and when you talk about preserving the earth, we have protecting the earth and its resources versus maximum exploitation for wealth in this what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls billionaires feeding frenzy. That is the United States government these days, in which everything should be privatized, everything should be exploited, everything should be converted into wealth for the 1% at this point. So the longer view of Indigenous cultures, the longer view of preserving the earth, the strength that it gives us as human beings, feeling that connection and feeling our connection to future generations is not only important for the strength of our movements, but it's also important for our survival. I just want to give a quick example, which is that I just recently got back from the Argentinian Patagonia, where I was working with Mapuche communities who are under attack from the far right government of Javier Milei, who is opening it up even more because it's already been a reality for a number of years to international investment. This region has been targeted or identified by billionaires, some of the wealthiest interests in the entire world, including Saudi sheiks and emirs, including Sylvester Stallone and celebrities, including the Italian company Benetton and some major multi-millionaires, as one of the areas that will actually be habitable when they themselves make the rest of the world inhabitable. So in order for them to create their refuges and to exploit the freshwater and forest resources that are still preserved in this part of the country, they have to get rid of the indigenous community. And that's exactly what they're doing. They used to call Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics, but Milei is really the Trump of the lunatic fringe. And they have created an all-out assault on these communities. They are on the front line of what all of us need to be doing in their resistance. There's the whole press for oil and gas pipelines and oil and gas development in the United States. It'll affect so many of the communities. The point is, wherever you are, work with those local battles to preserve this, because it's really critical to where we want to go and how we want to fight back. It also provides a lesson in redefining what the links are between those local battles and the global battle. We can get really obsessed with what Trump is doing in the whole world and on this massive scale and one thing after another. But we need to bring it down to work to earth and say and get involved in those community fights as well, and say this is going to be the ground that we stand on. This is literally going to be the ground that we stand on to resist. Another point is to that people can do is to talk to family and friends. Statistically, I mean, just common sense, we all know people who voted for Trump and who are perhaps still supporting this process. As binational citizens, we can talk to them directly about what a trade war means, why it's important what happens to Mexico as an ally, as human beings, as families that have binational connections. What the threat of military invasion to fight drug wars, who that really benefits and who that could really, really hurt. What is really behind the drug war, some of the things we talked about earlier, and really listen to what they say. Because what's happening here, they talk about the battle of narratives, but it's really, it comes down to human emotions. We're not even talking about political arguments so much as what are the insecurities? What are the real concerns of people who think this is the answer? Where did those real concerns go off course, So listen to what they say and put it back together in terms of where you are in a way that can bridge and create dialogue on some of the issues. There's always going to be people who white privileged males, who are going to say, well, this obviously benefits me, so whatever not swear word I can use. Anyway, and you won't have real a chance to create dialogue with them because they're absolutely right. This does benefit them, and we're never going to convince them otherwise. But to a large majority of the people, there's a lot of room for dialogue there, and it has to take place. And then the third thing would be to defend women's rights, the return of patriarchy and this drive to push women back into the home, sorry, into forced reproduction, into the pro-natalist movement is coming on strong now among white women, into forced sterilization among women of color and in other countries, and even genocidal and extermination campaigns among other populations. All of this is very real. And it's a fundamental basis for this new fascist wave that we're seeing, and that one of the points that woman who's a leader in reproductive and sexual rights in Brazil, Sonia Correa, was making when I talked to her recently, is she's saying, this is the first time we've seen fascism come directly out of the superpower, the nation that is the most powerful in the world. And it's probably the first time, too, that we've seen anti-gender policies being so central to that whole movement. So fight for women's rights and for the rights of the most vulnerable sectors in general. These sectors will be a barometer of what's happening and how far they can get, and how much these kinds of measures will be normalized by the rest of the population. So those most vulnerable sectors include migrants, they include LGBTQ plus populations, they include women, they include children in a lot of ways, and of course they include people of color in the United States, but also all over the world. we are really seeing a major reconfiguration of power in the nation and in the world. And it's anti-democratic, clearly, but it's also anti-life as we know it. If we're not able to create those bridges, which we can do, if we're aware that we need to climb out of our issue silos, our sector silos, because creating those bridges is really going to be fundamental to standing up to what's happening now, to reverting it, and to surviving this time of Trump. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Laura. So we will continue to to the second part, the Q&A session. We will have more or less 8 questions. So raise your hands. It's one question per person. So Bob will help me with the microphone. So raise your hands to get the microphone. Thank you.
I had a question over something that you didn't address, and that's the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. Looking historically, is the exact type of person that you would name as ambassador if you were trying to overthrow a government. He's got CIA and counterinsurgency experience. I don't know much about this, but I understand there's some military training by U.S. people in Mexico, and it seems as though Mexico has cooperated with military drone surveillance in Mexico by the U.S. And I'm wondering to what extent you think the possibility of a coup is a real threat, and whether there are people within the Mexican military or elsewhere that would collaborate with that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the background. I think that's a clear message that that's going to be the relationship, that it will be focused on US interest. Well, it's always focused on US interests in Mexico, but that background of counterinsurgency and CIA training is also a clear message of an openly interventionist relationship within the country. I think, the Mexican government has kind of laid low on that one, and they're going to see how it plays out. But it's an ominous sign. I I don't know. I think that it might be early to talk about possible coups. I think that would be a highly risky, move on the part of the president of Trump. Even as late as after the US election, I was still running into people in Mexico in comments and everything who were saying that that Trump was going to be a less interventionist president because he wasn't interested in getting involved in foreign wars. I think we're very clear that that's not going to be the case. But taking on Mexico is far different than taking over the Panama Canal, or threatening to take over the Panama Canal, or buying Greenland, which is obviously the biggest signs we've seen yet of his international aspirations. So I'm not anticipating that now, but I think that we have to watch, especially those signs of justifying troop invasion on the basis of cartels. Um, yeah, and I guess I mean, I certainly appreciate the concern, and I wouldn't rule out anything at this point. But for the immediate future, I think that it's probably not in the cards.
Thank you. I have had a great deal of experience with USAID and PEPFAR programs. And I want to emphasize the point you made that USAID has been the largest funder of family planning and reproductive health for decades. So the anti-gender equality issues of this administration are really very strong as a goal. I also know from people with PEPFAR funding that even if the HIV/AIDS programs restart, they will not be able to allow to provide integration of reproductive health care with HIV and AIDS. Right. That's a fact. I can tell you that right now. So my question to you, and I also know because I'm a volunteer with an organization that does a great deal of work here in this hemisphere, that there are Mexican grassroots organizations of reproductive health and rights that are now helping organizations in the United States. I'm hoping that we're humble enough in the US to be able to learn and take guidance. My question to you really has to do with the policy level commitment of the Scheinbaum administration to women's rights and women's sexual and reproductive health rights and justice in particular. She hasn't spoken much on that, at least not that I have heard.
Yeah, I mean, now because we had the March 8th mobilization, there was a reiteration of some of those policies. Mostly they were directed toward the violence against women because it's certainly the predominant theme with among the young women who march on March 8th. But I would tend to agree. I mean, I want to get back to you on a deeper analysis of that. And in fact, we're in the process of doing it. But my sense is the same as yours, that we're seeing that there's been a lot of progress, obviously, in abortion in the past administration. We're going to see a push because it's necessary for the states to come on board with all of that, for it to become a practicable, a reality, the right to abortion within the country for all Mexican women. And I think that there's a commitment there. However, budget-wise, especially, um, I think that I think that there does need to be quite a bit more. Um, I'm not sure about how much USAID money in Mexico in particular was in these areas. We've seen cutbacks already from the gag rule and from the right wing at different points within the history of USAID to prevent it going to not just abortion, but also to even sexual education or organizations that include mentioning the fact that abortion in countries where it's legal, that is abortion is an option. We've already seen a lot of those efforts in the past as well, but it's certainly true that USAID continue to be very important for that. I think, yeah, basically that I do want to come back on that in terms of exactly how much it's going to impact Mexico and how much commitment there is on the part of the Sheinbaum. And I think that it'd be fascinating to continue to talk directly, given your concrete, your specific involvement in that field, about where the needs are and where the changes are. We have a comment, we have a question in the chat as well. I'm going to read it. There's a woman, and Anne is saying there's a woman named Aida Ruiz in San Miguel who's bombarding Facebook with hate speech toward liberals and anyone else who won't support Trump. She says we are evil and going to hell. That's how most of the MAGA folks are. I don't believe that there's any room for dialogue. And does it and that so I think I kind of addressed that by saying obviously there's a hardcore of people that you're not going to be able to, not just the people who are actually benefit the privileged, but also people who are just ideologically so convinced. And also, and it's important that she made this statement that this woman is saying that are evil and going to hell, because fundamentalism and the religious basis of this movement is a very, very important part of it. And so and it's a part of it that's also probably much of it, that fundamentalism, is not open to dialogue either. And then she asked, does it help for U.S. citizens to leave the United States and move to Mexico or elsewhere? Or should activists stay in the United States to fight here? That's completely, a personal decision. And I think, yeah, so I wouldn't answer it on any other basis but that personal decision. I don't think there's a right or wrong on either one of it. And it also depends from this feminist intersectional perspective of like whether you're a woman or, in what group you are and how it affects you in different ways, and what potential or what possibilities you have to defend yourself and your family in different ways too. Then it says the hardcore is the largest group. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that someone was saying to me just yesterday, they were saying one of the problems we're facing in the United States is that many people have this impression. And since they have this impression that everybody's supporting, or the vast majority is supporting Trump, they're feeling immobilized. They're feeling marginalized, in fact. The statistics don't necessarily bear that out. He barely won the popular vote, and we have been seeing recently a number of sectors that have been impacted by his policies that are becoming disaffected at a rapid rate. So I'm not sure about that. I think, maybe we don't have an exact statistic, but I can certainly understand the second part. I'm exhausted trying to have a polite conversation and being attacked. Protect yourselves too. I mean, I encourage going into dialogue where you can, but look for the places where it's not going to exhaust you. Look for the ways in which you can work that's not going to make you feel like you're powerless, because we're not powerless. I think this is a time when self-care and when collective care and when self-protection are important too. It's a brutal time emotionally for many of us who are not only seeing what's happening with the Trump administration, but we're seeing that the values that we held most dearly and that we fought for all our lives are being trampled upon and mocked by a huge proportion of our neighbors, of people that we considered reasonable and are part of our daily lives. So yeah, so take care. Do what you can. Don't give up, find the sustenance that you need for your heart and soul during this battle as well. Let's see. So Susan Goldman's saying, hi Susan, I've talked to people and heard of people who support Trump and are fans of Bernie Sanders. Well, we have the statistics basically on how many people went Obama Trump. There's a sense of there's been an elimination of the middle in not only US politics, but in politics everywhere. And I think this is where personally I would say that the Democratic Party is just lost. They're offering nothing to stand up to this. It's been hugely disappointing. And if there's a way out, it's going to have to be a way out that looks to new solutions. People talk about extremes between Trump and Bernie Sanders. I don't know if I'd call it extremes, but it's certainly a widespread feeling among the population. And like I say, it's not just in the United States, that something really new has to happen, that there have to be new solutions, there have to be new proposals. And that's why they're so capable of swinging from the left to the right like that. I'm not surprised that people feel that way, because it's the middle that just caved in terms of being seen as any kind of option for the future.
We have another question here in San Miguel.
First, I would like to thank you for your presentation. It was even more comprehensive and far-reaching than I could possibly have expected. So, and following up on the last points that I think you were making, I think there's openings now among people who are Trump supporters who are disillusioned because of what has happened so far. And so I think we have to stop demarcating those who voted for Trump and those who didn't. And there has to be allies formed, as you're saying. But I'd like to make one way of doing that. There are local elections from the bottom, from your library boards, the city council, county councils, sewer boards, whatever, all the way up through the state and the federal representatives. And now special elections around the country for people who were Trump supporters and are now taken into the administration. So in terms of the possibilities of alliances with those who are needing to, enhance growth of the whole world, how do the politics local and on up fit into that in your vision? And are there new ways of incorporating that?
Yeah, I think definitely, I mean, from outside, it's, I think, been surprising that, for example, all the layoffs, people haven't coalesced, that some of that disillusionment hasn't coalesced a little bit more or become visible. I think we need to see the press making a bigger effort to find out what's happening with a lot of that, because I also get the impression that it's happening. When we looked at a lot of the data that came out of the election, in fact, it turned out that many people did not actually know the policies that Donald Trump was running on beyond the catchphrases and some of the major ones like border security or something, or stop the invasion, or and so I think I think that means that a lot of people are kind of shocked at what's happening in different ways, and that they'll come together. And I really do think, that the local level is a good level to work at. That what you do when you say get rid of a Trump supporter or place somebody at a local level is not only gain whatever state power is involved in that election, but also begin to chip away at the narrative that what people want on the grassroots level is what's happening now. And you begin to create a different situation that can build from the bottom up. I've always been a strong believer in building from the bottom up, and now even more, because it turns out that it was so easy to, well, it's something that should have been obvious, and I guess in some ways it was, that working from the top down is that the people on the top control the top, And a lot of people here in Latin America have been asking me lately, how is it possible that we like put our lives on the line to elect progressive governments, and then those governments get in office and they can't move. They're unable to change the system. And then the far right elects a government, and all of a sudden it's able to dismantle everything we've been working for the last who knows how many decades. Well, the answer is fairly obvious, that because they're allied with global powers, with global economic powers, and they're the top political power. So we have to take that into account. We always work with very concrete power analysis. And unless you begin to change the thinking at the base, we can't really change that position, because we can't change that situation, because we are not the ones who are there at the top calling the shots. And every day that goes by, and especially every day that goes by in the Trump administration, they have more wealth and they have more power. And the power that we have is in numbers and in unity. And that's something that we're going to have to build from the base, and it's going to have to be a more medium long-term process.
Thank you. Could I ask a question about what's going on with gun policy in Mexico? And I think it's the flip side of the fentanyl issue in the United States. If I understood you correctly, you thought that was really a demand problem in the US, that Americans want fentanyl, and where there's a demand, there'll eventually be a supply. Is that also the case essentially in Mexico with regard to guns? That it's unlikely the US Supreme Court is going to hold gun manufacturers liable for the guns that make their way to Mexico. So it seems to me that Mexicans in some fashion want the guns that American gun manufacturers are all too happy to supply. And that there's got to be some way of dealing with the demand side of it in Mexico, which means apparently dealing with the cartels. And I'm wondering if you've got any insight on how President Sheinbaum is trying to approach that question.
That's interesting. It's interesting because I hadn't thought about the supply side, the critique of the supply side argument being applied to guns. I do, however, think that there's a major difference. When we talk about the supply side argument being used to stop drug use, we're talking about a population that's not a criminal population. It's just a population of mostly young people, of people who, for whatever reason, are seeking drugs to within their lifestyle. Now here, when we're talking about a hardcore criminal population. And so the way that you deal with, and also it's not a health issue, it's a criminal issue. Why they want guns to kill people, to make money. And in the United States, the whole drug demand, if it weren't for prohibition, would not exist, to be filled by a black market or to be filled by, the criminal drug trafficking organizations. So I think that there is an important distinction there to be made. Now, going back to what's being done about the cartels in Mexico, when they began to be dealt with, which is pretty much as criminal organizations, as a security risk instead of an illegal business, or just a black market. And they began to be dealt with through the use of the armed forces, and going into public security, something that is basically not prohibited, but every single human rights organization has warned of the social consequences of using armed forces to attack in public security, which is the situation with the drug cartels. That's when the whole violence in Mexico thing exploded, as we can easily prove. That's how, in large part, Lopez Obrador got into office, by saying there has to be a different model from the drug war model. Now, there's some indication that the root causes argument of providing more jobs and support for young people so they're not so easily recruited into drug cartels has had some effect. We're beginning to see a decrease in the homicide levels. It's still not so much that we could say that it's a definite trend, but it has been decreasing for, I think it's 3-4 years now. So it's beginning to look like a trend. We're not necessarily seeing a decrease in the control, both territorial and social control, that the drug cartels are exercising, particularly in certain areas of the country. The administration is really kind of still doesn't have a truly coherent security strategy that can present to stand up to the imposition of the drug war model that's coming out now in even more forcefully from the United States. That is to say we don't want to go after drug kingpins because we know that it just creates more violence. We want to start going after the laundering and the financial side of it in a much bigger way, which the United States government does not want to emphasize because it makes them in large part the culprits rather than Mexico, since much of that laundering is going through and supports the U.S. banks. We don't see that, number one, because of the political pressures from the United States, and number two, because it's been many, many years in which Mexico really has not had as a coherent national security strategy that's independent of the interests of the United States. So it's an area in which we have to, I have to look deeper into some of the changes, but I am so far, my impression is there haven't been sufficient changes to create a new dynamic that would reduce the violence here in Mexico and could eventually reduce the power of the cartels. Ending prohibition in the United States and beginning to treat it as a health issue is always obviously essential to any new model. And now we're seeing that things are going in the opposite direction, despite some kind of wishy-washy rhetoric at certain moments of the Trump administration. So I think that things are very likely to get worse before they get better, because also when you have an intensification on the one side of drug cartel power, and you begin to intensify armed forces and militarist power, you just have this constant spiral of escalation. And I think that we're in that, and it's one of the things that the Trump administration is hoping to promote because of how it feeds into that arms industry and how it feeds into ways of terrifying and controlling social sectors that they want to terrify and control.
The last question.
Question, just picking up on your dealing with the cartels, are there other issues where you think in the intermediate or longer term, Mexico will benefit from the dislocations caused by the Trump administration?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I really do. I think that this is a wake-up call to become more independent, both economically with some of those programs that they've talked about, stronger internal market, more food and energy sovereignty, although I hope that that does not lead into a further emphasis on fossil fuels. Um, and economic and trade policies that are far more based on Mexican interests than the neoliberal globalization model that's been followed up to now. I think that there's real opportunities. I think that the Mexican population has showed that it's on board with delinking in many ways from that U.S. dependency. It's not a short-term process, and it can be fairly disruptive. It will be fairly disruptive at different points, but I do see it as an opportunity. I'm glad to see this new emphasis to the, even if it's mostly discourse up to now on sovereignty and self-determination. I think Mexico is beginning to say, hey, we are really different from the United States in a lot of different ways. And then in terms of, nationalism is a double-edged sword. It can be militarist, it can be dangerous, it can not serve the needs of a people. But when you talk about it in terms of standing up to a threat as big as the Trump administration posed now, it can also be a way of bringing people together in order to say, this is what we're for and this is what we're against. So I do see a number of opportunities there. And it will really depend on how people respond to those opportunities, and not just in a way that sort of follows the Mexican government's lead, but in a way that begins to define their own interests, even like we were saying, from the local level on up, to be able to find those opportunities and build in those cracks that are created now.
Ryan, the last question.
Thank you very much for a great and very informative talk. And I wanted to thank you for raising the issue of Gaza as well and flagging that as a moral issue for our time. And watching a genocide in real time has been horrifying, truly horrifying. I want to say that there is a
It's been
small
going
group.
on for your whole fucking lifetime.
I don't know what he's saying there, but let me just continue with my question. So there is, my understanding is that the Scheinbaum regime did offer support for the South African case in the international courts. And I wondered to what extent will the regime be able to continue to take an independent position despite what is clearly counter to the American position, and to what extent can we see also making the links between the genocide in Gaza and the women's movement, for example, here in Mexico, which has been so strongly against violence. Well, violence against the women and children of Gaza, the link is very, very clear. So that's my question.
Yeah, well, they did support the South African case and they were pretty clear about it, but they didn't ultimately, and I'll have to double check, but at the last time we did a program on Palestine a while back, but they did not formally sign on to it. So there was a sense there that they were supporting South Africa, that there was a clear call for a ceasefire at the beginning, but they fell short in a number of ways too. And I haven't heard anything lately, so it'll be really, I have to look that up again to see. I mean, I did kind of and didn't find any recent statements on it. I think with so much coming out, they're sort of, I don't know. They've been a little wishy-washy on it. It could definitely have taken a stronger stance. Of course, that can be said for almost every country in the world. It's been highly disappointing what's happened in terms of solidarity with Palestine. Mexico recognizes Palestine, of course. But at this critical moment in which the ceasefire is about to totally fall apart and there's increased violence not only in Gaza, and Trump saying that he wants to build a Trump Tower instead of letting the Palestinians back into their homeland, you would expect that there would be some stronger statements coming out of not just Mexico, but other countries as well. And so far, I haven't seen it. All right. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope I can come up soon to see everybody and we can continue talking. I'd love to be in touch to see, what you're all doing and thinking there. We've got some more comments here. People, and I've talked to people. Let's see. I don't know if anybody said thanks. Thanks from Dick Snyder, a friend from way back when, and you all know from Global Justice. Thanks, love the program, miss you. That we certainly feel the same way. Well, here's Anne saying we don't have a medium or long term. That could very well be true, but we can't think of, if we think only in the short term, we're going to be reactive and we're likely to burn out as well. So we're going to have to construct that medium to long term, even if it's only in our imagination, in our hope, in our hearts. Because if we don't have that, if we don't have those longer dreams, I don't think we're going to get through this. And yeah, so thanks for your comments and thanks for your presence.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you, everyone.